There are killers who make headlines. There are killers who shock the nation. And then there are killers so far ahead of their time, operating in places so remote and isolated, that their crimes go unrecognized for what they truly are until it's far too late, if they're recognized at all. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host. And before we descend into the Appalachian Mountains to uncover one of America's most overlooked potential serial killers, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The stories we tell here are the ones that history nearly lets slip away. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story takes place deep in the Kentucky mountains, but its implications reach far beyond those isolated hollows. Today, we're traveling back to the early 1900s, to a region where death was common. Doctors were scarce, and a woman with a little medical knowledge could kill with impunity. To a series of suspicious deaths that went uninvestigated for years. And to a woman named Bertha Hood, who may have been America's first identified female serial killer decades. Before anyone knew what a serial killer was, this is the story of Bertha Hood, midwife, healer, neighbor, and quite possibly one of the most prolific murderers in Appalachian history. Breathitt County, Kentucky, early 1900s. This is rough country steep mountains. Narrow valleys, isolated communities, connected by dirt roads that become impassable in winter. The nearest town of any size is Jackson, the county seat, but most people live in small settlements scattered throughout the mountains, accessible only by horseback or on foot. Life here is hard. Poverty is endemic. Medical care is virtually non-existent. The nearest doctor might be a day's ride away, and most people can't afford to pay for one anyway. When someone gets sick or injured, they rely on folk remedies, prayer, and the local healers women who've learned traditional medicine from their mothers and grandmothers into this world. Bertha Hood was born around 1870 in the hills of Breathitt County. Little is known about her early life, but by the time she was in her 20s, she had established herself as a midwife and healer. She attended births, treated illnesses, prepared herbal remedies, and was called upon whenever someone in the community needed medical help. In a place where infant mortality was high and death from disease was common, Bertha's services were essential. She was respected, trusted, even revered. When Bertha Hood showed up at your door with her medical bag, you believed she was there to help. And most of the time, she probably was. But over the years, people began to notice a disturbing pattern. When Bertha attended a birth or treated a sick person, sometimes the patient would take a sudden turn for the worse. Sometimes they would die unexpectedly, despite having seemed to be improving. At first, no one thought much of it. Death was so common in the mountains that losing a patient wasn't unusual. Childbirth was dangerous. Infections were deadly. People died, and that was just how life was. But the deaths kept happening. And slowly, whispers began to spread through the mountain communities. Whispers about Bertha Hood, about how people who crossed her seemed to die, about how families who couldn't pay her would lose a child soon after, about how convenient it was that certain people who stood in Bertha's way, or who had something she wanted, would suddenly fall ill and die. The whispers reached a crescendo in 1917, when a young woman named Sarah Collins died just hours after giving birth, a birth that Bertha Hood had attended. Sarah's family, already suspicious, demanded an investigation, and what authorities discovered would shock even the hardened residents of Breathitt County. But to understand what happened in 1917, we need to go back further. We need to look at the trail of deaths that followed Bertha Hood throughout the mountains. We need to examine the victims that no one connected, until it was far too late, because Bertha Hood may have been killing for years, before anyone realized what she was doing. The first documented suspicious death connected to Bertha Hood occurred in 1905. though there were likely others before that went unrecorded. A baby boy, born healthy according to witnesses, died within hours of birth. Bertha had delivered the child and had been alone with him for a brief period, while the mother rested. The official cause of death: failure to thrive. But the baby's grandmother later told neighbors that the child had been perfectly healthy before. Bertha took him into the next room. When she brought him back minutes later, he was gasping for air. He died shortly after, and Bertha claimed it was a congenital defect that only became apparent after birth. In 1907, a wealthy landowner named James Mitchell fell mysteriously ill after a dispute with Bertha over payment for her services. He had hired her care for his ailing wife, but had refused to pay what Bertha demanded, claiming she had done more harm than good. Within weeks, James was violently ill, vomiting, seizures, intense abdominal pain. He died within a month. His family suspected poison, but there was no way to prove it. Bertha claimed he must have eaten something tainted, and without an autopsy, which would have required transporting the body to Lexington and paying expensive fees, there was no way to investigate further. In 1910, twin babies died within a day of each other, both delivered by Bertha. The mother survived, but was devastated. Bertha told her it was God's will, that the babies had been too weak to survive. But neighbors whispered that they had heard the babies crying strongly after birth. Before Bertha spent time alone with them, in 1913, an elderly man who had accused Bertha of stealing from him while she cared for his sick wife died suddenly in his sleep. Bertha had brought him a tonic the night before to help him rest. He never woke up. The pattern was there. But in isolated mountain communities with no centralized record-keeping, no medical examiner system, and no way to communicate between settlements, no one put it together. Each death was treated as an isolated tragedy. And Bertha Hood continued her work, moving from community to community, delivering babies, treating the sick, and leaving a trail of suspicious deaths in her wake. By 1917, Bertha Hood was in her late 40s and had been practicing as a midwife for over 25 years. She had delivered hundreds of babies, treated countless illnesses, and earned a reputation that was complicated. Some families refused to call for her, preferring to take their chances without help rather than invite Bertha Hood into their homes. Others, particularly those who couldn't afford a real doctor, had no choice but to accept her services. Sarah Collins was 19 years old, newly married, and expecting her first child in the spring of 1917. Her family was poor. Her husband worked in the coal mines, but they were well liked in their community. When Sarah went into labor on March 15th, her mother sent for Bertha Hood, who was the only midwife available. Bertha arrived and took charge. The labor was difficult, but not unusually so. After several hours, Sarah delivered a healthy baby girl. Witnesses Sarah's mother and sister later testified that both mother and baby seemed fine immediately after the birth. Sarah was exhausted but alert. The baby was crying lustily. Bertha cleaned the baby, swaddled her, and handed her to Sarah's sister to hold while she attended to Sarah. The sister stepped out of the room briefly to announce the birth to the family waiting outside. When she returned less than 5 minutes later, Bertha was standing by the bed, and Sarah was convulsing. The baby, now back in Bertha's arms, was silent and still. Sarah died within minutes. The baby was already dead. Bertha claimed that Sarah had hemorrhaged suddenly, that it was a complication she couldn't prevent, and that the baby had been born with a heart defect that only became apparent after birth. She said she had done everything she could, but sometimes God called mothers and babies home despite the best efforts of those trying to save them. But Sarah's mother wasn't accepting that explanation. She had been present at the birth. She had seen Sarah immediately after, alive and well, and she had heard the baby crying with strong, healthy lungs. Something had happened in those few minutes when the room was not fully supervised. Something that Bertha Hood had done. Sarah's mother went to the local sheriff, Ezra Thompson, and demanded an investigation. She told him about the other deaths, the babies, the old man, James Mitchell. She said that everyone in the mountains knew Bertha Hood was dangerous, but no one had ever been able to prove anything. Sheriff Thompson was skeptical. He knew Bertha. Hood had even called on her services himself when his wife was ill. But he also knew that Sarah's mother was a respected woman, not prone to hysterics or false accusations. And he had heard the whispers about Bertha. He decided to investigate. And what he uncovered would expose one of the most shocking criminal cases in Kentucky history. Sheriff Thompson began by interviewing families who had employed Bertha Hood as a midwife or healer over the past decade. He traveled from settlement to settlement, talking to anyone who would speak with him about their experiences. What he found was a pattern of suspicious deaths that was impossible to ignore. In case after case, people told similar stories. A patient who had been improving suddenly took a turn for the worse after Bertha gave them medicine or food. Babies who were born healthy died mysteriously within hours. People who had conflicts with Bertha fell violently ill soon after. Thompson documented at least 15 deaths over 12 years that seemed directly connected to Bertha Hood, and those were just the ones he could verify. People suspected there were many more that had gone unrecorded, but suspicion isn't proof. Thompson needed physical evidence, and in 1917 rural Kentucky, that was nearly impossible to obtain. The victims were long buried. Exhumation would be expensive and controversial, and without modern forensic science, even if they exhumed bodies, proving poisoning would be difficult. Thompson decided to focus on the most recent case, Sarah Collins and her baby. The bodies had been prepared for burial, but not yet interred. He obtained a court order to delay the burial and had the bodies examined by the only doctor available, Dr. William Hayes from Jackson, who had to ride for an entire day to reach the Collins home. Dr. Hayes's examination was limited by the technology and knowledge of the time, but what he found was suggestive. Sarah showed no signs of the hemorrhaging that Bertha had claimed killed her. The baby's lungs contained fluid, but showed no evidence of the heart defect. Bertha had described Dr. Hayes couldn't definitively prove poisoning, but he could state that Bertha's explanations for the deaths were inconsistent with the physical evidence. That was enough for Sheriff Thompson to arrest Bertha Hood on suspicion of murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Breathitt County. Bertha Hood, the midwife who had delivered half the babies in the region, who had treated countless families, was being accused of murder. Some people refused to believe it. Others felt vindicated. They had always known something was wrong with Bertha Hood. Bertha was taken to the county jail in Jackson to await trial, and it was there, during interrogation, that she finally began to talk. Bertha Hood's confession, if it can be called that, was partial and contradictory. She never admitted to deliberately killing anyone. But what she did reveal was almost more disturbing than an outright confession. According to Bertha, she had been doing God's work. She claimed that she could see which babies were meant to live and which were not, that some children were born marked by sin or weakness, and that it was a mercy to send them on to heaven before they could suffer in this hard world. She talked about defective babies, children born with disabilities, or to mothers who couldn't care for them properly. She believed she was saving these children from lives of suffering by quietly ending their lives shortly after birth. As for the adults who had died under her care, Bertha's explanations were vaguer. She suggested that some people were too sick to save, that their time had come, and that she had simply helped them along to ease their suffering. She didn't call it murder. She called it mercy, but when pressed about specific cases, particularly James Mitchell, who had been in a dispute with her over payment, Bertha's composure cracked. She became defensive, angry. She said that some people deserved what happened to them, that they had been cruel or sinful, that God had used her hands to deliver his judgment. It was a chilling glimpse into the mind of someone who had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner, all while hiding behind the guise of a trusted healer. The confession was problematic from a legal standpoint. Bertha hadn't admitted to specific criminal acts. She had framed everything in religious terms: mercy, God's will, divine judgment. And in 1917 Kentucky, with limited forensic evidence and no physical proof of how the victims had died, prosecutors knew they had a difficult case, but they also knew they couldn't let Bertha Hood go free. The pattern was too clear, the suspicions too widespread. If they didn't act, more people would die. Bertha Hood's trial began in November 1917 and lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom in Jackson was packed every day with spectators, some traveling for days to attend. It was the most sensational trial the county had ever seen. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, family members of the deceased, neighbors who had witnessed suspicious behavior, local officials who had investigated deaths. They presented Dr. Hayes's medical examination of Sarah Collins and the baby. They read portions of Bertha's confession, emphasizing her belief that she had the right to decide who lived and died. The defense argued that Bertha was being scapegoated for tragedies that were simply the result of poverty, poor medical care, and the harsh realities of mountain life. They pointed out that infant mortality in the region was over 30%. Was it really so suspicious that a midwife who delivered hundreds of babies would have some die under her care? They suggested that Bertha's religious views, while perhaps extreme, didn't constitute evidence of murder. They argued that Sarah Collins had likely died of complications from childbirth that even a trained doctor might not have been able to prevent. But the prosecution had one piece of evidence that proved devastating: testimony from a former assistant of Bertha's, a young woman named Martha Simmons, who had trained under Bertha as a midwife. Martha testified that she had witnessed Bertha suffocate a newborn baby in 1915. The baby had been born premature and small. Bertha had declared it wouldn't survive and had held a cloth over its face until it stopped breathing. When Martha had protested, Bertha had told her it was a mercy, that the baby would have suffered, and that Martha would understand when she was older and more experienced. Martha had been terrified and traumatized by what she'd seen. She had stopped working with Bertha shortly after, but she had never reported it, fearing no one would believe her word against Bertha's. Now, with other evidence mounting, she found the courage to speak up. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On November 30th, 1917, they returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the death of Sarah Collins. They couldn't prove all the other deaths, but they were convinced that Bertha had deliberately killed Sarah, likely through suffocation or poisoning. Though the exact method remained unknown, Bertha Hood was sentenced to death by hanging. She showed no emotion when the sentence was pronounced. She simply nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. When asked if she had anything to say, she replied, "God knows I only did what was right. He will judge me, not you." Bertha Hood's execution was scheduled for March 1918, but it would never take place. In February, just weeks before the scheduled execution, Bertha became violently ill. She claimed she had been poisoned, that someone had gotten to her food in prison, that her enemies wanted her dead before she could reveal more secrets. The prison doctor examined her and found her suffering from what appeared to be acute poisoning. The irony was not lost on anyone. Bertha Hood, suspected of poisoning dozens of people, was herself possibly poisoned, but the doctor also noted that Bertha had been receiving packages from supporters, people who believed she had been wrongly convicted, who saw her as a victim of mountain superstition and prejudice. It was possible she had poisoned herself, either in a suicide attempt or in a bid to delay execution. Bertha survived, but was left severely weakened. Her execution was postponed while she recovered, but she never fully regained her health. On June 15, 1918, Bertha Hood died in her cell at Kentucky State Penitentiary. She was 48 years old. The official cause of death was listed as complications from poisoning, but no investigation was ever conducted into who might have poisoned her, or whether she had poisoned herself. Bertha Hood was buried in the prison cemetery, in an unmarked grave. Her death ended the case, but left many questions unanswered. In the aftermath of Bertha's trial and death, authorities attempted to investigate the full extent of her crimes. Sheriff Thompson and his deputies traveled throughout Breathitt County and neighboring areas, interviewing families and examining records. They documented at least 32 suspicious deaths that appeared connected to Bertha Hood between 1905 and 1917. The victims included 18 infants, most dying within hours or days of birth. 7 adults who had been in disputes with Bertha. 4 elderly patients under her care. 3 young children who had survived difficult births but died weeks later, after Bertha visited to check on them. But these were just the deaths they could document. Many more were suspected, but couldn't be verified. Families had moved away. Bodies had been buried for years. Records were incomplete or non-existent. Some historians and criminologists believe Bertha Hood's actual victim count may have been much higher, possibly 50 or more, over her career as a midwife. If true, this would make her one of America's most prolific serial killers, operating decades before the term serial killer even existed. But why? What drove Bertha Hood to kill? Modern psychological analysis of the case suggests several possible motives operating simultaneously. First, there was genuine belief in eugenics and mercy killing. Bertha seemed to truly believe that some babies were better off dead, that she was saving them from lives of suffering. This twisted sense of mercy may have started with legitimately terminal cases and gradually expanded to include any baby she deemed defective or unwanted. Second, there was financial motive. Families who couldn't pay Bertha's fees often lost children. Bertha may have been punishing those who didn't value her services appropriately. Third, there was revenge. Several of her adult victims had been in conflicts with her. Bertha appeared to use her position as a healer to settle scores, poisoning or smothering those who had wronged her. Fourth, there may have been a psychological compulsion, a need for power and control. As a poor woman in a deeply patriarchal society, Bertha had limited power in most areas of her life. But in her role as midwife and healer, she held life and death in her hands. That power may have been intoxicating. Finally, there's evidence that Bertha simply enjoyed killing. Some of her victims had done nothing to her and weren't defective by any measure. She killed them because she could, because she had found a way to murder with impunity, and because some dark part of her took satisfaction in it. Bertha Hood was likely what we would now call a comfort killer, or angel of death, a caregiver who kills those under their care. These killers are notoriously difficult to catch because they operate in contexts where death is expected, and they use methods that mimic natural causes. The Bertha Hood case had lasting impacts on Kentucky and Appalachia more broadly. It exposed the dangers of unregulated medical practice and the vulnerability of isolated communities to predatory individuals. In the years following Bertha's conviction, Kentucky passed laws requiring midwives to be licensed and regulated. Regular inspections and reporting requirements were established. While enforcement in remote mountain areas remained spotty, the legal framework at least existed. The case also contributed to the slow decline of traditional midwifery in Appalachia. Hospitals began to be built in larger towns, and even poor families started to prefer hospital births over home births attended by midwives. The trust that communities had placed in traditional healers had been shattered. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Bertha Hood case is how completely it has been forgotten. Unlike other early American serial killers who have been extensively studied and written about, Bertha Hood has largely disappeared from history. Several factors contributed to her obscurity. First, she was a woman. Female serial killers have historically received less attention than male ones, both in media coverage and in criminological study. Second, she operated in a remote, rural area. Her victims were poor mountain people, not wealthy urbanites. Their deaths didn't generate national headlines. Third, she killed during a period when America was focused on World War I. Her trial and death in 1917-1918 coincided with America's entry into the war, and newspapers had bigger stories to cover. Fourth, the victims were often infants or marginalized people whose deaths were seen as less important than those of more prominent citizens. Finally, the case was uncomfortable for Kentucky's image. Bertha Hood represented everything the state wanted to move beyond: poverty, isolation, backward medical practices, superstition. It was easier to let her story fade than to preserve it as a reminder of darker times. Today, very little documentation of the Bertha Hood case survives. Court records were lost in a fire in the 1940s. Newspaper accounts are fragmentary and scattered across multiple small-town papers that have long since ceased publication. Most of what we know comes from local oral histories and a few academic papers written by regional historians. I spent months researching this case, traveling to Kentucky, searching through archives, interviewing descendants of people who remembered the story. What I found was a tale that has been almost completely erased from history. A female serial killer who may have operated for over a decade, killing dozens of people, in plain sight of everyone who knew her. The Bertha Hood house, where she lived when she wasn't traveling to attend births, still stands in Breathitt County. It's abandoned now, slowly collapsing, surrounded by overgrown vegetation. Locals avoid it, claiming it's haunted, though whether by Bertha's spirit or the spirits of her victims, no one can say. I visited the house in 2024. It's accessible only by a rough dirt road that requires four-wheel drive. The structure is barely standing, roof partially collapsed, walls rotting, windows long since broken. But you can still see the layout, a simple two-room cabin with a loft, typical of the region and period. I stood in what would have been the main room and tried to imagine Bertha Hood living there, preparing her medicines, planning her next killing. The isolation is profound. The nearest neighbor is over a mile away. It's easy to see how someone could love here and keep terrible secrets, how deaths could be quietly disposed of without anyone knowing. There's no historical marker, no acknowledgement that one of America's potentially deadliest serial killers lived in this spot. Just a collapsing cabin slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The families of Bertha's victims are still in the region. I spoke to descendants who remember stories passed down great-grandparents who lost babies to Bertha Hood, ancestors who survived only because they couldn't afford her services and went without a midwife. One woman, whose great-great-grandmother's baby died under Bertha's care in 1912, told me, "We always knew. Everyone in the family always knew. But back then, who was going to believe us? Bertha Hood was respected. We were just poor mountain people. And the baby was already dead. What could we do?" That sentiment, "what could we do?" echoes through all the accounts of Bertha's crimes. Families suspected, but they had no power, no resources, no way to prove what they believed. And so Bertha continued killing, protected by isolation, poverty, and the trust that people placed in healers. The story of Bertha Hood forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. We have extensive documentation of male serial killers from the same era, age, Holmes, for instance, who was executed just 20 years before Bertha's trial. But Bertha Hood, who may have killed just as many people if not more, has been almost completely erased from the historical record. This erasure serves no one. We can't learn from history we don't remember. We can't recognize patterns we refuse to see. And we can't honor victims whose stories have been lost. Bertha Hood's victims deserve to be remembered. The babies who died in their first hours of life. The mothers who trusted Bertha to care for them. The men and women who fell ill after crossing her. They were real people with families who mourned them, who suspected the truth but couldn't prove it, who had to live with the knowledge that the person who killed their loved ones would never face full justice. And we need to remember Bertha Hood herself, not to glorify her, but to understand her. She was a serial killer operating in a time and place where serial killers weren't recognized or understood. She exploited a system that gave her access to vulnerable people and asked no questions when they died. She hid behind the veneer of being a healer, a helper, someone people called on in their most desperate moments. How many other Bertha Hoods were there? How many other healers and caregivers in isolated communities killed with impunity? How many suspicious deaths were attributed to God's will or natural causes when they were actually murder? We'll never know. But recognizing that they existed, that women like Bertha Hood killed long before we had the language or frameworks to understand what they were doing is important. It reminds us that evil doesn't have a gender, a specific time period, or a particular location. It can emerge anywhere, in anyone, especially when conditions allow it to flourish unchecked. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets. Some are beautiful ancient stories, traditional knowledge, deep connections to land and community. But some secrets are dark, and the story of Bertha Hood is one of the darkest. This has been the story of Bertha Hood, midwife, healer, and quite possibly one of America's first and most prolific female serial killers. A woman who killed for over a decade in the mountains of Kentucky, whose crimes went largely unpunished, and whose story has been almost completely forgotten. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Case Files. These forgotten cases are some of the most important we tell, because they reveal how history can be lost, how victims can be forgotten, and how the powerful can disappear even when they're caught. If you made it through this entire episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future cases. And share this video help ensure that Bertha Hood's victims are remembered, even if their names are lost to time. Leave a comment and tell me, have you heard of Bertha Hood before? Should there be more research into her case? How many other forgotten serial killers might be hidden in history? And remember, trust but verify. When someone has power over vulnerable people, whether as a healer, caregiver, or authority figure, we must maintain oversight and accountability. Because without it, predators like Bertha Hood can kill for years before anyone stops them. Rest in peace to all the victims of Bertha Hood, the babies who never got to grow up, the mothers who trusted the wrong person, the families who suspected but couldn't prove. You deserve justice. You deserve to be remembered. And though your names may be lost, your suffering was real, and it mattered. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking questions. Because the most dangerous criminals are often the ones we trust most completely. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and Bertha Hood may have been forgotten by history, but her victims and the lessons of her crimes must not be. Remember their names, even when we don't know them. Honor their suffering, and never forget that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces.